Good evening, everyone. Welcome to a public program of the Massachusetts Historical Society. My name is Catherine Allgor, and I'm the president of the society. When I think about us, I like to say we're a place for a great conversation, sort of writ large, conversations among scholars, historians to the general public, between teachers and students. And boy, tonight's event is certainly a demonstration of that. You are in for a great conversation. And like all good conversations, this one is a continuing one. So let's get started. I'm going to turn you over to Gavin Kleespies and have a wonderful time. Enjoy the conversation.
Thank you, Catherine, for that greeting. And good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our program, Protest and Citizenship Revisited. Before we begin, I'd like to let you know a little bit about the Massachusetts Historical Society. We are the oldest historical society in America, dating back to 1791, and have been an independent nonprofit institution dedicated to collecting, preserving, publishing, and sharing our state and our nation's history for the past 230 years. We provide virtual programs for the general public, academic audiences, and educators, as well as making our collection of almost 14 million manuscript pages available to researchers worldwide. We do this for free, thanks to the support of our members, and we hope that if you enjoy our events or our research collections, you will support MHS. My name is Gavin Kleespies, and I am the Director of Programs, Exhibitions, and Community Partnerships for MHS. And I'm happy to welcome you to what I think will be a very special program. We began this conversation almost exactly 3 years ago, at a moment in American history when it seemed that we were witnessing protests on a scale that we hadn't seen in decades, with the Women's March and Black Lives Matter's protests galvanizing hundreds of thousands. At the time, it seemed that that we needed to understand the historical context of these protests. 3 years later, as we have seen larger protests, occupations of U.S. cities, and a riot that ransacked the U.S. Capitol for the first time ever. Now it seems more important than ever to understand the context and to understand what has changed in 3 very dramatic years. The program tonight will feature 4 preeminent thinkers on issues of protest and citizenship. Each of them will give a brief 5-minute context of their area of study. We will then have a moderated conversation, bringing their historical perspectives to bear on how we got to the world of today. Finally, we'll open the program up to questions from the audience. To introduce our speakers tonight, we are joined by Stephen Kantrowitz, who is the Planart Bascom Professor of History at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He studies race, politics, and citizenship in the 19th century United States. He received his PhD from Princeton and his undergraduate degree from Yale. Feimster, who is an associate professor in the Department of African American Studies and the American Studies program at Yale University. Her research and teaching interests bridge the fields of social and political history with a research focus on racial and sexual violence, social movement, war, law, and citizenship. She received her PhD from Princeton University, and we're happy to welcome her back as she previously held a long-term fellowship with the Mass Historical Society. Chad Williams is a Samuel J. and Augusta Spector Professor of History and African American Studies at Brandeis University. His studies focus on African American and modern United States history, African American military history, the World War I era, and African American intellectual history. I may sound a little bit like a broken record, but he also received his PhD from Princeton University and his undergraduate degree from UCLA. He's also an advisor to MHS's African American History Seminar Series. And finally, Hasan Jeffries is an associate professor of history at The Ohio State University. He studies civil rights and Black power in the 20th century and has been involved in a number of public history projects, including the renovation of the National Civil Rights Museum at the Lorraine Hotel in Memphis, and hosting the podcast Teaching Hard History, a production of the Southern Poverty Law Center's Education Division Teaching Tolerance. He received his PhD from Duke University and his undergraduate degree from Morehouse College. So without further ado, I think that we're going to go in the order of Professor Kantrowitz, then moving on to Professor Feimster, then to Professor Williams, and finally Professor Jeffries. So Professor Kantrowitz, if you'd like to join us, that would be great.
So hi everyone, welcome. Thanks for being here, and thanks to Gavin and to MHS for inviting me to come back. It's always a real pleasure to be in your space, real or virtual, whether doing research or anything else. So, as you said, Gavin, about 3 years ago, several of us who are here tonight participated in a panel here at MHS on the theme of protest and citizenship. And on all of our minds were the ongoing protests back in 2018 against police violence and about the emergence of Black Lives Matter as a collective demand for safety, dignity, and belonging. More distant in our minds, at least based on the record of what we had to say that evening, which I looked at the other day, was the very different protest a little more than 6 months before that seminar in Charlottesville, Virginia, the frightening and murderous white nationalist gathering dubbed Unite the Right. So here in early 2021, protest and citizenship do in fact look a little different. We've witnessed and perhaps taken part in protests that followed the murder of George Floyd, really a long season of mass protests on a larger scale than anything else in our lifetimes in this country. And we can't know what the fruits of these protests will ultimately be, but as historians, we know they did not come from nowhere. They were not spontaneous, they were not a prairie fire or a tidal wave. And tonight I know we'll plumb the deep roots of the traditions of protest and citizenship rooted in African-American communities and institutions and culture that gave them birth and sustained them and continue to sustain them. But here in early 2021, we have another very different protest tradition ringing in our ears, which is the insurrection of January 6th, which sought to stop the constitutional process certifying the presidential election. And that protest too did not come from nowhere. And so to open this event, I want to reflect for a few minutes on where it did come from, not by thinking about the 2020 election campaign, but about the 19th century. And I want to tie that story to the one that brought us all here in the first place, the history of protest for equal citizenship, because I think these two histories are powerfully related, and they have been for a very long time. 3 years ago, at the first Protest and Citizenship panel, I opened my remarks by describing how pre-Civil War free Black activists dubbed themselves colored citizens. And I said that was an act of protest against their unequal and degrading conditions of their freedom, and it was an act of invention, an assertion that their race and color were not disqualifying, that in fact, that disqualification gave the lie to the nation's claims to be a republic. To claim the status colored citizen was an act of political and social organization. It gave life to movements ranging from militant mass protests that liberated captives from return to slavery, all the way to organizing to vote for the best available candidates wherever Black men were legally allowed to do so. What I want to draw our attention to is the way that these early assertions of Black citizenship through protest and through politics brought a fierce and continuing backlash from the political and social forces that were determined to maintain the United States as a white republic. Think here about the South Carolina Declaration of the Immediate Causes of Secession in 1860, which was the South Carolina legislature's explanation of why South Carolina needed to leave the Union. And a lot of it had to do with the violation of the National Compact, allegedly, because the Republican Party had come to power and was going to prevent slavery from extending into the territories. But a lot of it had to do with the fact that in some places, the Republican Party had welcomed the votes of African-American men and admitted them to the category of citizen of the United States, effectively, by doing so. And this is not an incidental feature of the grievances that the secessionists present as the reason that they need to break the United States apart in 1860. But white nationalism of that kind did not only come from slaveholders. Stephen Douglas's campaigns for the Senate in 1858 and for the presidency in 1860 were also rooted in white nationalism. So in 1858, when he runs against Abraham Lincoln, or when he and Lincoln run against each other for Senate in Illinois, the litany of the Democratic Party is that the Republicans, Lincoln's party, are the, quote, Black Republicans. And that is because as the anti-slavery party and the party that here and there has been voted for by a handful of Black men is therefore Black. In other words, the blackness of any blackness associated with a political movement is a stain that affixes to it in the same way that the stigma of slavery attaches to free Black people. And yet it's not just from secessionists and from white nationalists in the Democratic Party. When Stephen Douglas's forces denounce the Republicans as Black Republicans, and in the Lincoln-Douglas debates, you can see in the margins, they call them Black Republicans, Black Republicans. Lincoln's supporters, the Republicans in the audience shout back, white, white, pushing themselves away from Blackness as though they too need to imagine a white republic. So this is a very profound tradition that cuts across party, it cuts across the spectrum of white politics. It is a kind of almost consensual element of American democracy on the eve of the Civil War. And it's only the mass participation of African Americans in self-emancipation and in the Civil War armies that begin to transform that. When the war begins, Black volunteers are turned away. This is a white man's war. Black volunteer meetings are broken up by police in northern cities. But military service and self-assertion, and then the demands of national politics in 1865 and 6 produce Reconstruction. And that fundamentally changes the Constitution and the terms of political life across the South and the nation. African-American citizenship claims are given life on the ground and freedom through organization and mobilization. The 14th and 15th Amendment rewrite the concept of citizenship to include people without regard to race. The Justice Department and the Enforcement Acts are created to defend and sustain those rights. And at the same moment, the backlash against these transformations surges to the fore in the direct violent retaliation against the exercise of citizenship rights, of assembly, speech, property ownership, voting, militia service, in countless small incidents and in large massacres in Colfax, Louisiana, and Hamburg, South Carolina, among other places. And then in cultural proxy wars against African-American citizenship claims, the sacralization of the Confederacy and the idea of states' rights, the exclusion of African-Americans from citizenship through permitted proxies for race, property, and education, the rise of taxpayers' movements among white people that defend the rule of white property holders. And all of these are successful by the turn of the 20th century in overthrowing resurgent interracial coalitions, for example, in North Carolina, in the Wilmington Massacre and Coup of 1898, in which the white supremacist rebels who overthrow that city government declare what they call a white man's Declaration of Independence against interracial politics. And then finally, and this is where I'll conclude, in the conquest of the teaching of American history and the reclamation of the United States as a white republic at the highest levels of thought and politics. In 1901, there's an article in the Atlantic Monthly that justifies the overthrow of Reconstruction and the disenfranchisement that followed in the name of good government and fiscal restraint. And it concludes, however unfortunate it might be, that when Reconstruction was overthrown, African Americans, quote, were left to carry the discredit and reap the consequences of ruin when at last the whites who were the real citizens got control again. That was by Princeton University professor Woodrow Wilson. I will leave it there.
Thank you very much, Professor Kantrowitz. Professor Feimster, if you are ready to go, we can unmute yourself and turn on your camera. We look forward to hearing your comments. Great, and thank you for coming. I know that you're dashing off from a past meeting. So.
I am thrilled to be here and in conversation with y'all. And my lighting is all weird right now, but hopefully you can see me well enough. So we have 5 minutes. Of course, I have like a 30-page paper ready to go on this topic, but nonetheless, I'm going to keep us in this present moment and make some connections to the scholarship that I've done in the past. So on January 5th, the historic victories of John Ossoff and Reverend Ralph Warnick solidified Georgia's political transformation and created a 50-50 split between Republicans and Democrats in the Senate. This came on the heels of the first election of a Black Asian woman to the vice presidency of the United States. So the double victory ensured Democratic control of the US Senate, where the former Democratic senator and now the first female, first Black and first Asian American vice president, Kamala Harris, will serve as the tie-breaking vote. Taking together the historic elections of Vice President Harris and Senator Osanoff and Warnock bring into clear focus the instrumental role of that Black women played in the 2020 elections. In fact, 91% of Black women voted for President Biden and Vice President Harris. Black women, however, did more than cast their votes on Election Day. In Georgia, hundreds of Black women, including Stacey Abrams, the former minority leader of the Georgia State House and founder of the New Georgia Project and Fair Fight, spent years working to expand the Democratic electorate that would ultimately propel Democrats to victory in the 2020 Senate runoff. Thousands of Black women in Florida, South Carolina, Tennessee, Georgia, Louisiana, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Alabama, and Mississippi joined LaTosha Brown, co-founder of the Black Voters Matter Fund, to increase Black voter registration and turnout in their states. As we know, Black women's political efforts in this election did not go unchallenged. The day after the Democrats won the runoffs of Georgia and Congress convened to certify the results of the 2020 presidential election, a white supremacist pro-mob invaded the Capitol in an effort to overturn the election, incited not only by Trump's refusal to accept defeat and his violent call to action, but also by the racial and gendered implications of the Democratic victories. The rioters declared themselves patriots intent on saving the republic. Mobilizing racist, anti-Semitic, and misogynist discourse, rioters killed a police officer, assaulted and injured hundreds more, and threatened to assassinate House Speaker Nancy Pelosi and Vice President Michael Pence. Despite the sexism and misogyny that undergirds white supremacist politics, it comes as no surprise that white women joined Trump in his effort to overturn the election and to disenfranchise millions of voters. During her runoff campaign, Republican Kelly Loeffler not only supported Trump's refusal to acknowledge his defeat and concede the election, but also joined him in pressuring Georgia state officials to overturn the election. And while we have heard much about the Proud Boys who Trump called to stand back and stand by, we have heard far less about Women for America First, an organization founded as a challenge to liberal feminists and in support of Trump's America First agenda. Led by Amy Kramer, a political activist from Georgia, Women for America First perpetuated the lie that Trump won the election and organized pro-Trump rallies under the banner of Stop the Steal and Save America that ultimately culminated on January 6, 2021 with the violent attack on the Capitol. And let us not forget Georgia Rep. Marjorie Taylor Greene's violent white supremacist rhetoric. As a historian and feminist who has written about the ways in which both Black and white women have engaged in American politics, often with Black women organizing for justice and inclusion and the citizenship rights on one side, and white women violently campaigning to maintain exclusionary politics of white supremacy on the other, I cannot help but center Black and white women in how I make sense of the elections and the January 6th riots. In my research, I have sought to understand when and where Black women's political interests intersect. In Southern Horrors, Women in the Politics of Rape and Lynching, I focus on the one hand on Ida B. Wells' organized protest against rape and lynching, which were denying Black people their rights as citizens for equal protection under the law. On the other hand, I highlighted Rebecca Latimer Felton's work, a suffragist and white supremacist feminist out of Georgia, who was the first white woman to serve in the US Senate, and how she organized white women in her campaigns for political power and to maintain political power in the South, on the other hand. So all too often, I think Black and white women have been on opposite sides of the struggle to expand the racial and gender meanings of citizenship. Of course, this is not to say that white women and Black women have not worked together in struggles for racial and gender equality, but to insist that white supremacy continues to exacerbate the differences between Black and white women and to pit women against one another. And if there's anything that we can learn about the history of the late 19th century and the early 20th century, is that sometimes these crossroads or these moments where we see a clash between Black visions of citizenship and white visions of citizenship actually creates an opening for women, Black and white, to come together and articulate and organize against a kind of patriarchal white supremacy that serves to keep Black and white women from coming together. And I'm happy to talk about in more detail the kind of historical context that make it really difficult for Black and white women to come together on political issues around citizenship rights. And I'll end there.
Thank you very much, Professor Feimster. Professor Williams, we're ready to hear you. Oh, there you are. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Two very tough acts to follow. Pleasure to be part of this conversation, and thank you everyone for joining us this evening / afternoon, depending on where you are. So during our first iteration of this conversation in 2018, I focused my remarks on the context of 100 years ago, in 1918. I talked about the tension between protest and citizenship for African Americans in the context of World War I, and specifically W.E.B. Du Bois and his prescription at the time for Black people to, quote unquote, close ranks, quote unquote, forget their special grievances and place their civic duty to the nation above their immediate fight for equal rights. So I thought this evening it might be appropriate to kind of continue that story, to pick up where I left off in some ways, to think about protests and citizenship in the 1920 and 1921 moment. And again, think through these historical legacies using W.E.B. Du Bois. Indeed, reflecting on the events of 2020, the continuation of anti-Black violence and the protests for Black life and citizenship, as well as the white supremacist attacks on American democracy culminating in the riot at the Capitol on January the 6th, 2021, it's fair to say that Du Bois warned us. A century ago, Du Bois warned us. And he warned us in his 1920 book, Dark Water, Voices from Within the Veil. Crafted as a sequel of sorts to his most famous book, the 1903 classic, The Souls of Black Folk, Dark Water is a similarly experimental text combining poetry, short story fiction, memoir, pieces of previously published essays. But even more so than Souls of Black Folk, it is a book of protest. It is a book seeped in both rage as well as hope that exhibited the full range of Du Bois's remarkable intellectual, artistic, and political gifts. The context of the book is everything. He began Dark Water in 1918, but revised it throughout 1919, one of the most tumultuous years in American history. Although I'm sure 2020 is going to be like, hey, just wait until historians get a chance to write about me. But 1919 was an incredibly tumultuous year. It was a year defined by the contested nature of American citizenship in the wake of the World War, and protests, defined by protests, violent and nonviolent, over just who should be seen and treated as American citizens. And African Americans, literally and figuratively, were on the front lines. 1919 was a year drenched in blood. Violence exploded throughout the country, with white people protesting through attacks on Black life and property, any changes real or perceived in the racial status quo. In the South, the number of Black people lynched skyrocketed to at least 76. At least 11 returned Black servicemen, Black veterans, lost their lives to Southern vigilante justice. From Washington, D.C. to Chicago to Elaine, Arkansas, race riots and full-scale pogroms erupted north and south in cities large and small and in rural counties alike. James Weldon Johnson, at the time working for the NAACP, described this period as the Red Summer of 1919. Du Bois would describe this moment as a period of unprecedented and unexpected reaction. But African Americans also fought back. They returned fighting, as Du Bois wrote in a famous May 1919 editorial in the Crisis magazine, which he edited. This spoke to a new spirit of resistance and self-confidence inspired by the war. This upsurge in Black radicalism and Black protest came to be known as the New Negro Movement. Organizations such as the African Blood Brotherhood, the Universal Negro Improvement Association, led by Marcus Garvey, as well as a whole host of lesser-known groups, such as the League for Democracy, which was organized and led by Black veterans, provided an opportunity for Black people to translate their frustrations and aspirations for citizenship into movements for national as well as international change. So Du Bois wrote Darkwater with all of this on his mind. Through the book's 10 chapters and accompanying interludes, Du Bois explores the condition of being Black in relation to issues such as racial violence, colonialism and empire, class and economic inequality, women's rights and universal suffrage, labor and education. Above all else, Darkwater, as I read it, is a book about the relationship between race and democracy, right? And more pointedly, between race and citizenship. He takes his readers behind the veil to vividly articulate the meaning of being Black and the terrible costs of white supremacy. We know in America how to discourage, choke, and murder ability when it so far forgets itself as to choose a dark skin, he wrote. Also, from what he described as his veiled corner of the world, Du Bois exposes the meaning of being white, right? But what on earth is whiteness that one should so desire it? He asked in the searing opening chapter, second chapter, titled The Souls of White Folk. He continues, and I quote, "Then always, somehow, some way, silently but clearly, I'm given to understand that whiteness is the ownership of the earth forever and ever. Amen." Race, Du Bois makes painfully clear, is at the center of American life and an undeniable part of the identities of every American citizen. What did this mean for the future of American democracy at a time when the United States, as championed by President Woodrow Wilson, positioned itself as the exemplar of democracy on the world stage? And my daughter is making a special guest appearance. Hello, Layla. All right, I guess you're gonna be joining us. Oh, good. Du Bois had an answer. He wrote, "Instead of standing as a great example of the success of democracy and the possibility of human brotherhood, America has taken her place as an awful example of its pitfalls and failures so far as Black and brown and yellow people are concerned." Du Bois believed in democracy, the ideal of democracy. But he added, and I quote, "A true and worthy ideal frees and uplifts people. A false ideal imprisons and lowers." The subjugation of women, class exploitation, a lack of investment in education, and above all else, the denial of the right of every citizen to engage in the voting process had to end. He wrote, "If America is ever to become a government built on the broadest justice to every citizen, then every citizen must be enfranchised." I think this is a very poignant reminder as we are about to witness a new wave of disenfranchisement measures aimed at Black voters in the upcoming months. So Du Bois warned us. And in 2020 and in January of 2021, we witnessed the reckoning. In so many ways, Darkwater is the book of our moment. 100 years later, we are again grappling with the failures of democracy, the endurance of white supremacy, and the tension between hope and despair. We're still grappling with the relationship between protest and citizenship. Du Bois reminds us that these challenges are not new. And I look forward to continuing our conversation to continue to elucidate the ways in which they are indeed not new.
Thank you very much, Professor Williams. And Professor Jeffries, you're already here. Thank you. Take it away.
Well, thank you very much, Gavin. And it is a real delight and pleasure to be with you and the Massachusetts Historical Society, as well as to be with my distinguished colleagues from whom I continue to learn a great deal. My area of expertise and research and study is the African-American freedom struggle of the 20th century, looking forward, both looking forward and back into the 20th and 21st century. You know, when I think about protest and citizenship, and when I think about the African-American experience, and when I listen to my colleagues, what becomes clear, what should become clear to us all, is that African-American citizens and white citizens, African-Americans and white people have had, you know, from day one, these competing visions of citizenship, And in order to secure the basic rights of a citizen on the part of African-Americans, Black folk have had to engage in protest. This isn't something that is unique to the current moment that we are living in. This is not something that has been unique to the 1950s or 60s, the high point of the civil rights era. This is stretching all the way back into the earlier periods that my colleagues were talking about. So African Americans have this protest tradition. One of the things that is important, one of the themes that's consistent throughout the Black experience is the persistence of resistance. And within this culture of resistance has been the pursuit not only of basic human rights and basic civil rights, but specifically the pursuit of citizenship rights, the rights of citizens. And African Americans have had to pursue that through protest, through a variety of protest tactics and variety of protest means, but always through protest. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice only if you have people willing to exert the force necessary to bend it in that direction. And you exert that force through protest. The aim of the protest is really critical, right? This idea of these competing visions of what citizenship is on the part of African Americans is really about historically, and certainly we see this in the 1950s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, this high point of civil rights movement has been about expanding democracy, right? The aim of including African Americans in the body of citizens to secure their basic citizenship rights has been about expanding democracy. That's the only way that was going to work, moving from limited democracy to expanding democracy. But for many white Americans, and really for the history, you know, as long as we're talking about sort of the white folk understanding and defining citizenship, it has been just the opposite, right? It has been trying to limit democracy by limiting who is one, a citizen, but then also who can exercise their basic citizenship rights. I mean, this really is coming to a head in the post-emancipation era, certainly as we see, as was already pointed out in places like Colfax and Wilmington, North Carolina, and these other places, all the way through. I mean, the challenging and contesting of African Americans' assertion of their basic citizenship rights during that World War I period, and certainly we see it in the 1950s and 1960s. And the way in which, and this is why, you know, protests and citizenship and seeing citizenship with these contested visions is so important, because it helps us to understand the response to Black protests. And for so long, the response to Black protests, the default response to Black protests on the part of white Americans, especially where African Americans are a substantial number, a numerical minority or a majority, has been violence. The default response for white folk to African Americans asserting their basic citizenship rights has been violence. And African Americans in response typically have had to defend themselves, right? But so when we fast forward ever so briefly, just take a quick peek into the future from that moment till today, we see the persistence, not only of resistance and trying to secure basic citizenship rights on the part of African Americans, but we see part of that response, that default response, being violence. Now, we were talking about white mobs unmasked at the turn of the 20th century in the 19 teens and the like. We were talking about masked mobs to a certain extent, the Klan in the 1950s, 1960s, in Birmingham and Birmingham and the like. But as we move into the post-civil rights era, you still have Black folk engaged in protest, but anytime we see that protest, you still have the default response being violence, but this time it's emanating from police forces. That's one of the things that we see. That's just not limited to Birmingham, Alabama. That's also the response that we see in Watts in 1965, the response that we see in New York City and in these other places, in Miami, Florida, and more recently, in the wave of protests that swept across America. The perception that Black protests, the pursuit of basic citizenship rights, even if that's just in the form of demanding justice, fairness and justice for the victims of police violence, that is perceived as a threat, and the response to that threat has historically been violence. This last point, and then I'll open it up for conversation. On the one hand, we do have that consistently, right? The default being response, but the other default to Black assertion of their basic citizenship rights has been to disenfranchise, to try to limit African Americans' ability to participate in the political process up until, or certainly from the Reconstruction era, post-Reconstruction era, after we have that wave of disenfranchisement constitutions, state constitutions from 1819 to 1910, up until the Voting Rights Act, 3/4 of a century, the effort had been to wholly disenfranchise African Americans, to completely exclude them from the political process. When that is no longer possible, after the Democratic Party goes Black, if you will, we heard about sort of Black Republicans, suddenly a Black Republican Party now becomes a Black Democratic Party, and we see the flight from the Democratic Party by avowed white supremacists, pro-segregationists in the South into the Republican Party, then the effort is still about removing African Americans from the political process, but it's not about wholesale disenfranchisement. It then becomes about voter suppression. And because you only need to disenfranchise or remove a few thousand people from the ballot roll, the voter roll, in order to win an election. Apparently in the state of Georgia, as Crystal will point out, you only needed 11,000 and a couple hundred, right, in order to turn that election. So we move from disenfranchisement, wholesale disenfranchisement, to voter suppression, but the thread is the same. The impetus is the same, and the goal is the same. And so we're still dealing with the responses to Black protests as an effort to secure and maintain their basic citizenship rights, being this default to violence, whether it's individuals or emanating from the state, and this effort to suppress, to exclude, to limit African Americans' participation in the political process. And with that, I turn it back over to you, Gavin.
Thank you, Professor Jeffries. So I would ask all of our panelists now to unmute themselves and turn on their cameras. It's always good to see all of you. So we have a few questions that we worked on before, and then we'll turn it over to the audience questions later. So just starting off, there have been comparisons between police responses to Black Lives Matter's protests and the January 6th Capitol riot. But I haven't seen an in-depth framing of the January 6th riot as a backlash against large-scale Black Lives Matter's protests. Do you think it's useful to try to understand the January 6th Capitol riot, at least in part as a response or a retaliation against Black Lives Matter's protests of 2020? And I'll open this up to anyone who'd like to respond, but go ahead.
Well, I don't see, Go ahead, Chad.
I was just gonna say,
No. Go ahead, Crystal. I
go
think
ahead.
I'm going to channel you after. I'm going to channel you after. Go ahead.
I don't see how we can't, right? You know, if we're to understand the kind of dynamics of, you know, it's an idea that, you know, I was thinking through with Steve earlier today, the dynamics between kind of white supremacist politics and, you know, the struggle for, you know, civil rights and equality and human rights, right? There is a dynamic between those things, right? And so while on the one hand, I can talk about, you know, Stacey Abrams and Black women organizing, but that's part of a larger puzzle about sort of how Black people engage and organize, how Black people protest. So some of the protests in the summer, those didn't just come out of nowhere. Right? That's part of a long history of labor and work that people have been doing, whether we want to think about it in politics, whether we want to think about it in educational institutions, whether we want to think about it as grassroots organizing, but that this work and these conversations have been happening. And as Black people and social justice activists start to gain ground, right? Begin to get an audience, have people responding, right? Not just reacting, but actually changing laws, right? Letting people out of prison, right? Then there is going to be pushback, right? That power does not concede without a fight. And so to understand what happened on January 6th is to be in conversation with this longer history that links back to Reconstruction, right? When Black people are emancipated and then begin to make claims and demands on their rights as citizens, right? And the kind of, you know, every day, whether it's the rise of Jim Crow America, right, and the making of that, till the fights during civil rights movement, that this is part of a longer narrative. And as historians, we can finesse and pull out the nuances and how this is different, how this is similar, and how it's a break. But in fact, it's part of a dynamic that I think has existed in this country.
And I think I'll let everybody else jump in. I mean, we have to understand Trump as a very particular response to Black Lives Matter, right? He was elected in 2016 on this wave of anti-Black Lives Matter rage on the part of white folks, right? Of galvanizing these latent fears and anxieties that, again, you know, we can trace, you know, all the way back to the 19th century of Black people exerting their rights and their presence in the public sphere, right? And invoking, you know, these longstanding tropes, law and order, you know, make America great again, you know, first used by Ronald Reagan, you know, who started his campaign for president, you know, in Philadelphia, Mississippi, right? I mean, so he's building on this long legacy, but being very strategic in using Black Lives Matter in 2015, 2016 to galvanize, you know, white support, white nationalist support for his candidacy, right? And eventually, you know, using that to propel himself into victory. So that undercurrent, you know, has been there, you know, throughout his entire 4 years in office. So what we saw on January the 6th, you know, was in some ways just the natural culmination of that.
I just sorry.
Steven, go ahead.
Just to jump off that, Chad, you know, if you think about the big lies that have structured the Trump era, they began in birtherism, right? They began in the denial, the abject kind of lie denial that Barack Obama was born a natural born citizen of the United States, and have continued through a very specific set of claims on Trump's part that the election was stolen in particular places characterized by large majorities of Black voters. So there's a thread through here, and to connect it right to January 6th, there's the protesters saying to the cops defending the Capitol, "We supported you, why won't you support us?" Which is an, you know, absolutely clear linkage back to the summer's protests, and to that sense of white solidarity that they were positing and then feeling betrayed by.
Hasan, did you have?
Yeah, no. We can go on. No. They said it all. I'm good.
Okay. So we hosted a similar conversation back in 2018. Not all of you were there, but some of you were. Since then, the state of the world and the nation has grown even more precarious. And it seems as though American history scholars are being called upon more and more to give context to increasingly confusing and gut-wrenching events. Have the last few years changed anything about the way you think about or practice history, or how you conceive of the role of historians in civic life? And again, this is just a general question, so anyone can jump in.
I'll take a stab at that. I wouldn't necessarily, for me personally, I don't think it has changed the way I approach teaching history. I've always been trying to get students trying to get myself, but also trying to get students to understand the past to make sense of the present, so that they can help solve the problems that we are leaving them today in the future. But I think what we have seen and what is now necessary for us as teachers and scholars is that we really hold the line on truth, that we cannot sort of concede the ground of truth to these ideas of both sideism and these, people's feelings and emotions. Like, I get asked all the time by teachers, I want to teach about Black Lives Matter. I want to teach about the big lie that leads to the insurrection, but I'm getting this pushback. I'm like, you have the truth on your side, right? We just saw 30 million people take to the streets, many of whom were young people in the summer of 2020, demanding not only justice for victims of racial violence, but we tear down these Confederate statues and these monuments to white supremacy because they're a lie too. Our students, our young people are demanding that they be taught the truth, no matter how difficult and uncomfortable it makes people, and they deserve it. And it is our job as instructors, as teachers, as historians, as public intellectuals to make sure that we deliver on that.
Would anyone else want to weigh in?
A friend of mine likes to say that when people say, you only want to talk about the bad stuff, he says, you don't object to my interpretation, you object to the facts of American history. And the facts of American history make a lot of people very uncomfortable because they don't fit the myth of American history, which is this is the exceptional nation of the earth. And one of the things that the last year, I think, has brought home to a surprisingly large number of people is this might be a normal nation, right? This might be a normal nation on the planet. And it would be a great thing if we could get there.
Chad, I saw that you had unmuted if you wanted to.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's certainly an interesting moment because, like, we're not surprised. Like we know this history. Like, we know that what we've seen over the past, if we want to take it back to 2018, but certainly, over the past year and last month, I mean, this is America, right? This is America revealing itself and all of its ugliness, right? But it is what it is, to invoke the great Michelle Obama. But there has been, I think, an increased kind of burden placed on us as historians, and I think Black historians in particular, to try and explain this history. And I think that the challenge that we face is kind of mitigating our responsibility, our calling, our sense of vocation, versus the exhaustion of having to yet again explain that this is history. This is what we've been studying. This is what we've been reckoning with all of our lives. And certainly in the context of our professional careers as well. I'm glad that folks are starting to come around. But there's, I think, a type of dissonance that we have to navigate as well as historians. On the one hand, as Hasan so eloquently put it, our responsibility, our commitment to the truth, but at the same time, the exhaustion, the labor that comes along with that.
I want to just add, like Hasan and Chad and Steve, I mean, we've been doing this work. So in many ways, nothing has changed in the way that I teach or how I'm in public facing at my work and things like that. But I do think, I'm a historian. I think the context has changed around us in some ways, and that like the 1619 project, right? And Trump's response to that, right? Put us in a place where, we're having to confront what it is that you laid out, Hasan, that truth, right, and facts, right, and what it is we do, right, is rooted in research and training and professional training, right. So that I think and then in the context of the explosion around Black Lives Matter, which we as historians understand as like part of this long history, and that Black Lives Matter itself magnified the police brutality, but it was about something much bigger than police brutality, right? And so that means that there was this kind of tornado that, I think speaks to Chad's exhaustion, like I could feel the exhaustion, right? And that we're getting whipped up in, right? And we're still trying to just do what we've been doing, this sort of steady grind of writing this history and speaking to its usefulness in this present moment.
Thank you. So just to move on to one more of our questions that we had developed before, and then we can open it up to the audience. But the word protest conjures up images of people taking to the streets or high-profile demonstrations. We tend to think of protests as something highly visible. In the struggle for Black citizenship, what other forms has protest taken? What mechanisms of agitation or resistance have been employed by groups fighting for citizenship rights that we may not necessarily recognize today as acts of protest?
I'll just say ever so briefly, and my colleagues can draw on examples. If you name it, Black folk have tried it. I mean, there's the point is what haven't they done, right? I mean, because they've done it all. I think the key, though, in understanding it is time and place, because context really has dictated, and understanding what the white response to Black protests will be has dictated the ways in which Black folk will choose to agitate for their basic citizenship rights. But if you pick a period, they've tried it. If it was possible, Black folk tried it. But it changes. The desire has never changed, but the emphasis on strategies and tactics and what they will use has changed over time.
Right. So, I mean, I'll just point to the book that I framed my comments around, Darkwater, right? I mean, Du Bois, he wasn't going to be out there, marching and protesting and, in the streets. I mean, but he used his pen, he used his intellect, he used his artistic gifts, to protest in beautiful, poignant, and incredibly powerful ways. So when we look at kind of the whole range of different, literary, artistic, intellectual productions that Black people have produced, that's a central part of this kind of protest tradition that Hasan is talking about.
When we think about citizenship as something that has kind of an affective life for us, we talk about it. We describe people as solid citizens and acts of good citizenship, people striving for equal citizenship or fighting against second-class citizenship. What we're talking about 90% of the time is African American history. And so in some ways, our whole national conversation about what is good citizenship and how is citizenship manifested is a conversation we have in African American history. And that, so it's hard to untangle that from any aspect of American life that we think of as having to do with those rights or those feelings.
Great, thank you. So we have time for a couple questions from the audience. Ms. Jenkins wrote, I want to hear Professor Feimster talk more about the challenges of bringing Black and white women together on citizenship issues. So
it's a challenge, I can tell you that. And it is, but there are moments, right? That and one of the things that I try to do in Southern Horrors, Women in the Politics of Rape and Lynching, is to kind of show those moments where Black and white women are coming together around certain sets of issues, and how white supremacy becomes the wedge that divides, and that, so whether it's talking about Black and white women in the South in the post-Reconstruction, let's say the 1890s, trying to raise the age of consent laws, right? That both Black and white women are doing that, and that white women understand that in the South, Southern white men want to keep that age of consent law down to 8, 9, 10, because they don't want Black women bringing charges of sexual assault. Right, and white women understand that low age consent law allows their husbands and brothers and sons to sexually exploit and rape Black women. Right, so that's an issue which they can all agree on is not good. And if it's 8, they ain't saying. And sometimes, don't get me wrong, they might say it's mostly on the male side, like the age. They might make differences between race. Like if a Black boy is 10, he can be charged with rape, but a white boy has to be 13. But usually on the sort of female side of that question, they don't make a distinction between white women and Black girls. Like Black girls don't have to be 8 and white girls be 10, right? So you see that that's a place where white women and Black women are coming together. Convict leasing was also a site in which Black women and white women were coming together across racial lines and class lines, right, to make claims and arguments for a more humane prison system, right? And that what was inhumane and brutal about that system was the way in which Black women were treated under that system, right? And that, we see that in this moment, in the kind of populist revolt moment, and someone like Rebecca Latimer is doing this work, but she shifts, right? That she understands that white supremacy, that if she's on this side of the debate, she don't have a political platform, right? But that if she's able to mobilize white supremacy, then she has an entry into politics, and a powerful entry, right? And so for, almost a decade or two, she's mobilizing the myth of the Black rapist and calling for lynching and mob violence, right? Ultimately, she initially comes back to the other side of that question. So again, there are these moments where, I think if we understand civil rights and women's rights as about being human rights, which is a discourse that's articulated through Black feminist praxis, then white women have everything to gain. Right, but they don't understand, they haven't been able to fully embrace that because it's a difficult political line to hold, because we're often on the losing side of that struggle, right? But on the side of white supremacy, there's a way in which white supremacy seems to triumph here and again, right? It feels like a winning ticket. But one might argue, I might argue in this moment, it may no longer be a winning ticket, but I could be wrong. It's going to be there. But I think that white women have to understand that in terms of strategy, right, in terms of making the case for human rights, that they have to be on the side of Black feminist praxis.
One of the things that I think Black women's history and Black feminist praxis teaches us is how important it has been to white supremacy to command Black people's bodies. And for most of the nation's history, putting yourself on the team that's opposed to white people being able to command Black people's bodies has been a bad idea, politically speaking. And the moments when that's not true, like the Georgia election, this winter, are very, very interesting moments, and moments that really bear our, paying attention to and celebrating and learning from.
I would add ever so simply that white supremacy is the most powerful political organizing tool that America has ever created. And it not only resonates with white dudes with guns, it also resonates with the white women who love them.
So I think that we have time for one more question. So we have a question from Mr. Carey, who wrote, the myth of American exceptionalism has been largely a lie. Is it still something we should aspire to? Can we get there? Or is it dangerous thinking in that it allows us to believe that things will get better?
I got to jump in on that. Hell no, it's dangerous. We're in the middle of this global pandemic and we run around here with the myth of American exceptionalism thinking it's not going to touch us. And we got 500,000 people who are dead, right? I mean, this is real world consequences and we're seeing it now, and it multiplies out in so many other places. But to me, that's just a stark contemporary example of the risk and danger of this idea in our heads as Americans that we are somehow different, that this earth that we stand on is somehow different, and that we won't be impacted or affected in the same ways. That has been exposed to me within this last year.
What if
you want to look at it in the context that America has been exceptionally bad at practicing what it preaches. But yeah, I mean, I think that the violence that has been inflicted and legitimized, particularly upon Black folks, has been built, on the edifice of American exceptionalism, and tearing down that edifice, I think, is a critical part of trying to rescue this country's democracy and moral standing.
I think American exceptionalism, it makes us insist constantly that we are the best, and evidence be damned. And what if our aspiration instead were to be good?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything that's been said. And, I think, as Chad was saying, if we want to talk about where America has been exceptional, right, in modeling what white supremacy can do, right, and sort of what colonial settlerism can look like, right, in its treatment, that we have been exceptional in the way that we have engaged in enslavement and genocide, right, in the ways in which we perpetuate not just the myth of exceptionalism, but this idea of democracy as if it's a given, right? And that we are a nation that is about the equality, these myths of like equality and happiness and liberty of all. We have been exceptional in perpetuating that myth, right? And it does harm, right? And it means that the work that we do is always pushing the boulder uphill. We are pushing the boulder uphill because we have to contend with that myth of American exceptionalism. And if we can get that myth or move that mountain out of the way, right, then I'm not going to say the work might not be as hard, but then people are seeing, their eyes is open. The truth is, we done killed a lot of people. We enslaved a lot of people. We done bombed a lot of people. So get down with that.
Well,
sorry. In its last breath, the Trump administration bequeathed us this 1776 report, which is like a sacrament of modern American exceptionalism. And we can laugh at it, and it's been deleted and all the rest. but it's still, they're putting it into practice in the Oklahoma legislature right now. It's not like we've killed the beast. It lives, and we're going to be fighting it the rest of my life anyway. The rest of all of ours, I think.
Thank you all very much. I have to say that I serve on the American Association for State and Local History's 250th anniversary committee, and the 1776 report comes up frequently, and it is shocking hearing from other states what is happening. So I think this was a very eye-opening conversation and a great note to end on. I'll just turn it over to Catherine Allgor to say a farewell.
I just want to say that I sort of preface this by saying this was a place for great conversations. And I want to say to the panelists, you have given us a great conversation. Thank you so much. And I would invite everybody out there to go to masthist.org and find out ways you can enter the conversation too. So thank you all.